Recently, President Cheeto Nazi Donald Trump President Cheeto Nazi Donald Trump came out as a nationalist. And because blue checkmark NPCs will take any opportunity to signal their Trump derangement syndrome, many immediately hopped on social media to pound their drums with the Adolf Hitler comparisons. Which is true, Adolf Hitler did describe himself as a nationalist socialist, which is a redundant term, but interesting given the fact that these resistance knuckleheads are not comparing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Adolf Hitler, despite the fact that both are self-described socialists. And yes, Adolf Hitler was a total socialist. I've covered this before. But I think this is an important conversation. Is nationalism good? I mean, if alleged pro-freedom diet capitalists like Ben Shapiro are open to nationalism, then I guess America might be ripe for it. But according to the left, nationalism is bad. And I don't disagree. What's interesting about this is the fact that many on the left, like these knuckleheads that run Facebook pages like Occupy Democrats and Other 98% and Being Liberal, adore President Teddy Roosevelt. Look at this shit. The NPCs that run these pages even use Teddy Roosevelt to own Donald Trump, totally ignoring the fact that Teddy Roosevelt himself was a nationalist, and in fact made nationalism part of his 1912 campaign for the presidency. To quote his New Nationalism speech from 1910, "The American people are right in demanding that new nationalism, without which we cannot hope to deal with new problems. The new nationalism puts the national need before sectional or personal advantage. It is impatient of the utter confusion that results from local legislatures attempting to treat national issues as local issues. It is still more impatient of the impotence which springs from the overdivision of governmental powers. The impotence which makes it possible for local selfishness or for legal cunning, hired by wealthy special interests to bring national activities to a deadlock. This new nationalism regards the executive power as the steward of the public welfare. It demands of the judiciary that it shall be interested primarily in human welfare rather than in property, just as it demands that the representative body shall represent all the people rather than any one class or section of the people." And nationalism is not exactly new in America. As I covered in my video, The General Welfare Lie, Alexander Hamilton and some of the Revolutionary-era Federalists were pretty nationalist based on what they tried to bring to the table. But Teddy Roosevelt's definition of nationalism could be summed up like this: prioritizing the interests of the nation above the rights of the individual. And really, this is not much different than Adolf Hitler. Sure, Roosevelt was not nearly as destructive or genocidal as Hitler, but shared the same premise that the nation takes precedence over the individual. Further, unlike Hitler, Roosevelt was anchored by American traditions, the legacy of the Founding Fathers, and the Constitution. But like Hitler, Roosevelt was pro-government involvement in the economy and sought to drastically alter the Constitution. But most Americans today think fondly of Teddy Roosevelt for a variety of stupid reasons. The legend of Teddy Roosevelt being this tough badass, like the story about Roosevelt finishing a speech with a bullet in his chest, the tales of his hunting quests, and his involvement in the Spanish-American War. The left loves Teddy Roosevelt because he opened the door for the welfare state and the progressive movement. Outdoorsy people and environmentalists love Teddy Roosevelt for the national parks. Meanwhile, modern-day conservatives don't really disown President Roosevelt because, after all, he was a Republican, even though he totally ran on his own ticket in 1912 and cost Republicans the election while handing the Oval Office over to the worst president in American history. When I was in North Dakota over the summer, I went to a minor league baseball game where the local team, the hometown team, was named in honor of Teddy Roosevelt for his preservation of the local Badlands. The most obvious example of America's adoration of Teddy Roosevelt is the fact that he's on Mount Rushmore, thereby putting him in the conversation with great presidents like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. So, if you grew up in America, you've been bombarded with the impression that Teddy Roosevelt is this magnificent president. But Roosevelt was also a nationalist, clear about his stance that the American collective take precedence over the individual. Don't be so selfish pursuing your own happiness. Your country needs you. How dare these greedy corporations and monopolies do what's best for business? They should do what I think is best for America. When addressing the National Congress for Mothers, Teddy Roosevelt said that the duty of women is motherhood, namely for the sake of preserving the race, although it's hard to tell if he means human race or white race or whatever, but nevertheless goes on to suggest that women should be committed to the destiny of future generations, praising them for their self-sacrifice while scoffing at the idea of self-interest and material enjoyment. Again, this is a guy that progressives and modern-day liberals fawn over. What a great guy that Teddy Roosevelt was with his nationalism. Let's put him on national monuments and name schools after him. But President Cheeto-Nazi Donald Trump comes out as a nationalist? Whoa, buddy, you're starting to sound a lot like that Adolf Hitler guy, because Hitler called himself a nationalist. Hitler also called himself a socialist, but pay no attention to that because we can't go around ruining the good name of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the noble virtues of socialism. But while we're here, why don't we take a look at the difference between nationalism and socialism?
Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
Nationalism and socialism are both forms of collectivism that demand government involvement in the economy and everyday affairs for the sake of the public interest. Nationalists and socialists merely disagree over the details, like what the collective should be, whether or not to pretend that people have property rights, who the enemies of the state are, but both are pro-control nonetheless. As a German businessman said during the lead-up to the Third Reich, better to take orders from the Nazis than bullets from the communists. Now, I do think that a case could be made for American nationalism being noble because America is unique in the fact that it was founded on the idea of individual rights rather than founded for the sake of promoting some arbitrary group of people. Therefore, one could argue that American nationalism means being proud of reason, freedom, individualism, and capitalism, and that it's government's responsibility to protect these ideals. If that's the case, then sign me up. But as I've laid out, this certainly is not the case with progressive superhero Teddy Roosevelt, and I doubt that it's the case with President Trump given his rhetoric on trade wars and his feuding with America's top businessmen, and his opinion that national anthem kneelers should be fired, and his fondness for brutal dictators like the Saud royal family, Vladimir Putin, Rodrigo Duterte, and Kim Jong-un. As Leonard Peikoff once said, at least I think this is Peikoff, patriotism means loving your country because it's great. Nationalism means loving your country even if it's horrible. My overall point here is that 1, socialist scum like these blue checkmark NPCs are no better than nationalists, and 2, if we're going to agree that nationalism is bad and burn Donald Trump at the stake for coming out as a nationalist, then maybe it's time that we stop glorifying nationalist pieces of crap like Teddy Roosevelt.